Hello, everyone, and welcome to Season 3 of Serious Coin, the podcast where we have rich conversations about wealth. I'm your host, Kelly Willis Green. I'm so happy to be back with new episodes, and I want to thank my listeners for your kind words and your content ideas, your guest suggestions. Please, please, please keep them coming. I think one of my favorite comments was from a listener who told me that this podcast is a little like being in a restaurant and eavesdropping on a really interesting conversation at the next table. Well, I can promise you, today's conversation is an intimate one. It's about the rise and fall of an American dynasty. Imagine being born into the fifth generation of one of America's wealthiest families and growing up with tremendous privilege. Imagine then that as you step into adulthood, you watch your family fortune dissolve in just over a decade. That was the experience of my guest, Frances Stroh. She's a fifth-generation member of the Stroh Brewery dynasty and the award-winning author of Beer Money, a memoir of privilege and loss. Frances's family had founded the Stroh Brewing Company in 1850. By 1984, they'd built the largest private beer fortune in America, and they were on the Forbes 400 list. But come the 90s, the Strohs found their wealth and legacy crumbling, a saga that mirrored the decimation of the city of Detroit, where the company was headquartered. I'd been wanting to interview Frances for a couple of years, ever since I read her book, and finally the stars aligned. She was a fascinating guest and very candid about what led to the demise of the business. The Stroh story is a cautionary tale for families of wealth everywhere, and a reality check for anyone who thinks a financial dynasty is a birthright. It's a message that Frances is passionate about sharing, not only through her memoir, but today in her work as an advisor to enterprising families and their advisors on how to implement thoughtful succession and set future generations up for success. In reading Frances's memoir, it was interesting to me just how universal the themes are, particularly around money. And despite her family's affluence and prominence, and you have to realize the Stroh name was splashed across billboards and television commercials throughout her adolescence, and yet Frances grew up with an ever-present feeling of financial scarcity and frugality. We talked about the impact this had on her relationship with money and how ultimately she came into her own to become a savvy investor and businesswoman. And still, it was clear to me that certain aspects of her upbringing were totally unique to children of fabulously wealthy families, such as when I asked her about her first recollection of what it meant to be a Stroh.
One of my first recollections was the kidnapping drills that my father used to do with me when I was very, very little, probably starting at 4 or 5 years old. Of course, it was a time when kidnapping was something to be feared, but not as much as it is today. It seemed as if it was really well-to-do families who were more concerned about it, or famous families, than everyone. So that kind of helicopter parenting just wasn't going on in those days. I was thinking about this today. We as kids roamed the neighborhood and rode our bikes and walked to our friends' houses and went up to the store and bought candy. And we really weren't any different from other kids in that sense. But there was this sort of fear that my parents had, of course, and that was passed down to us, that kidnapping existed and we kids had to be worried about it. And so my dad would do these kidnapping drills every once in a while, where it was sort of this play acting. He would take me outside and I'd have to stand on the sidewalk near our house, and he would take the family car and drive around the block. And when he came around the block and appeared driving down the street towards me, I saw him as someone other than who he really was. He had changed his expression on his face. He became very fierce and scary looking. He would pull the car up in front of me and dangle a chocolate bar out the window and say, come here, little girl, or Franny, come over here. And it was this terrible and terrifying stranger. And I'd been instructed to run back into the house, which I would promptly do in tears because I was so terrified of my father becoming this other horrifying person. it's sort of a bizarre early memory, but it made such an impression that I had to write about it. And it was sort of defining as well when it came to the mixed messages around wealth that we had as kids, because on the one hand, my mother was very frugal, my father was very extravagant and a big spender. And we had to do these kidnapping drills because, well, of course, we can't afford to pay the ransom. So just don't get kidnapped. And here's how to avoid it. So
Being a Stroh, the feeling was that you could be a target and potential victim, and that must have been terrifying.
and there were other families who, other kids who grew up in a similar way who I've met as an adult, people who read the book and said, oh, yeah, wow, we had to do that too. So I guess we weren't alone, even though it seemed as if we were.
You grew up in Grosse Pointe, a suburb of Detroit, Michigan, which at the time that you were growing up, that had to be one of the wealthiest postal codes in America. And in the book you write, and I just want to read an excerpt from it, that money was everything in Grosse Pointe. You couldn't live there if you didn't have it, and some had a lot more than others. The social hierarchy favored the richest, oldest families who had settled the area and built Detroit from the ground up. The same families who lived on my street, whose children attended my private school, and who swam at my club. So it struck me that you were both kind of observer and witness to this hierarchy, and you were also part of it. How did you become aware of it?
Well, I think it was just sort of something that became obvious as I was growing up. Certainly, the divide between and the privilege in Grosse Pointe and the poverty in Detroit was so pronounced. And I describe it in a couple of scenes in the book where we're driving from Grosse Pointe. First, as a child, I'm driving with my brothers down to the brewery, which was in the city. So we cross over the border from Grosse Pointe to Detroit, and the city is impoverished, and the automotive industry has moved out to the suburbs and abroad, and there really aren't any jobs anymore. The city's crumbling, the population is destitute, and you see that from the window, and we're instructed to lock our doors as soon as we cross into Detroit. The hierarchy clearly existed then, but also in Grosse Pointe among the families who either worked in the automotive industry or owned the automotive industry. There was a marked difference between those families, and clearly their level of wealth and what neighborhood they lived in. And while Grosse Pointe itself was a wealthy suburb, there were, like in any suburb, some nicer streets and some lesser streets. So if you attended public school, which my brothers did, you mingled with different kids than you mingled with on the weekends when you went to the club to go swimming or to play tennis. So just that sort of thing was really clear from very early on.
I want to come back to your parents' relationship with money, because I think that's, all of our relationship with money is such a universal theme, and it's an important one in the book. And we all learn about money through our parents and our primary caregivers. And as you say, in your case, you got two very conflicting messages. Your mother, even though she came from money, had this sort of fear and scarcity around money. Can you give me an example or two of how that would manifest in her behavior?
Well, you're right. She was very influenced by the people who would line up at her door as a kid, which was during the Great Depression. People would line up at the kitchen door and ask for food. And my mother's parents had a cook, so they would just make extra food and give food to people who came to the kitchen door during the Depression. And my mother never forgot this. And it just influenced, I would say, her behavior around money for the duration of her life. She's been an investor, a saver, but with my father during the years they were together, I think they polarized each other. His spending habits and his ostentatious sort of buying sprees and his collecting when they didn't necessarily have all the money for the school tuition, or My father wasn't great at managing money, so he wouldn't necessarily set aside the money that was needed to pay all the bills, and he'd go out on these big spending sprees and collecting art and firearms and pipes and guitars and cameras. And so my mother was very polarized by that, and so her frugality became more extreme, and she was sort of into driving around, and if people put stuff out, on their front lawns or on the side of the street that they didn't want, she would look through it and bring things home and launder clothes and put them on our beds. And I remember coming home from college and there was a pile of clothing that had been dry cleaned and was hanging in my closet. And I was sort of like, where did this come from? And some of it had actually come from the street. People had put it outside.
She was ahead of her time. Like today, that would be like
she really was
repurposing, and she'd be selling it online.
I know. She would be the queen of Etsy these days.
Frances grew up with two polarizing and emotionally charged role models for managing money. And to give you an example of just how different her parents were from one another, as a young woman, Frances's mother drew on her inheritance to pay for her education, while her father apparently tapped his inheritance to buy a fleet of Jaguars. And over the course of their marriage, his spending accelerated. And in turn, so did her mother's anxieties, which ultimately contributed to the breakdown of their relationship. I wondered how Frances absorbed these two very different messages and what effect they had on her relationship with money.
So the way I absorbed this was to actually be pretty balanced around money. I'm sort of, I would say, right in the middle between my mother and father. And I absorbed sort of the entrepreneurial spirit from my mother's side of the family. My great-grandmother, my grandmother, and my mother have all been investors in the equity markets and in real estate. And I have gone on to do more of that in my lifetime, a lot more. It's been a big focus for me, but I don't feel any sort of extreme pull towards frugality or overspending. I'm just sort of wise and balanced around money, I think. So,
to what do you credit that wise and balanced approach to money?
Well, I think I just didn't want to adopt either my mother's pattern or my father's. And I had reflected on it enough, I suppose. But I also had the influence of my grandmother, who seemed very balanced around money as well. And I spent a lot of time with my mother's mother as I was growing up. And she was very smart with money, but also enjoyed having it and enjoyed the fruits of it. So I may have absorbed that from her.
I want to read you another sentence from the book, and this one's sort of around money and identity. And this, I think it was at the time that you became aware that there were maybe some problems. Money was part of one's identity. If you lost it, you lost yourself, or it seemed to me. And throughout my young life, I was keenly aware that this is just what we were doing, losing ourselves. That's pretty weighty stuff for a young girl. What did you mean by that?
Well, I think what I meant was, and this is something that I bring into my coaching that I do with families, with means and with generational wealth, until a young person goes out into the world and carves out their own identity and figures out who they are by following their passions and working towards their own goals that are separate from their families. It seems as if your family's brand name or wealth is a part of your identity. And I don't think my father allowed himself, and many other members of my father's generation and the Stroh family allowed themselves, even though they wanted to do something differently and they wanted to separate from the family and not necessarily work for the family business, they went out into the world and decided quickly that they were going to come back and work for the family business. So I think the rule was you had to work somewhere else for a year or two, and then you came back and you worked at Stroh's, and they were sort of groomed by their parents to believe that's what their destiny was. Whether my Uncle Peter, who ran the company in the 70s and 80s and the 90s, Peter Stroh would have liked to have been in the CIA. Unfortunately, he was hit by a truck when he was in CIA training. He was almost crippled. And during that time, he decided to go and work for the family business. My father wanted to be a photographer. He had incredible talent. His photos are in the book, punctuating, each chapter. And instead, he was discouraged by his mother from pursuing that dream, and he went and worked for the family business. So this was the generation that ultimately, the fourth generation of the Stroh family, that ran the business into the ground, because really they would have preferred to be doing other things, and they were on some level pressured to join the family business. So what happens in families like this is there's a over-identification with either the wealth or the brand, the family brand. And when there isn't enough separation and there isn't enough building of one's own identity, to the point where maybe you'd have something to contribute to the business, maybe in your 30s or 40s, if you've gone out and done other things. My uncle and my father joined the business in the early 20s. And so that sense of being identified with the business was very powerful.
I thought that was a powerful statement, that the fourth generation ran the business into the ground because essentially, although they were groomed to lead it, they would have preferred to be doing other things. It's always dangerous when a company is run more to honor a family tradition than for its own mission and purpose. And in this case, the family-run board presumably did not have access to, or maybe did not listen to, independent professional viewpoints to challenge their thinking. Another observation I had from the book was that if the problem of her father's generation was over-identification with the business and the wealth, Frances was clearly determined to forge her own path. After graduating from Duke University, she went to London on a Fulbright scholarship where she earned a master's in fine art from the Chelsea College of Arts and became an installation artist. But it was also around this time that she and other family members were becoming aware of the consequences of the corporate decisions that were destroying value. And these ranged from overly aggressive expansion to crushing debt to poor real estate and alternative investments that were made outside their core business. Her family's $9 billion fortune, in today's dollars, was crumbling all around her. And yet, from her memoir at least, it struck me that Frances seemed remarkably detached and unaffected by the destruction of her future inheritance.
Well, I would credit my mother for that, because she warned us as kids, don't expect the company to be there, don't expect the money to be there. And she couldn't have known the nuances of what was happening inside the company, but she somehow sensed, even before they started having family business meetings and sort of sharing with the family beyond the shareholder board meetings, what was really going on. The fact that strategic decisions had been made that had been ill-advised, such as not taking the $1 billion offer in 1982 from Alan Bond, the Australian financier, which clearly, if that had been invested in the early 80s, would be a tremendous amount of money today. Instead, because of the over-identification with the brands and wanting their sons to work at the company, the family-run board decided to not sell out and to stay in the beer business. So within several years, we were entertaining an offer of half that sum from Coors, and they actually backed out of the offer. And then 10 years later, we sold for pennies on the dollar to Pabst. So looking back, obviously with 2020 hindsight, it would have been a very good thing to take Alan Bond's offer. But again, and this is what I coach families through who are in business together, it's very easy to lose perspective and to think this is going to go on forever and sort of rest on your laurels and think that the business will always be successful. But that is not necessarily true. Industries change, and they change quickly. And as we all know, it's hard not only to hold on to money, but to hold on to a successful business.
I think everybody on some level, consciously or subconsciously, does fear the loss. either in their lifetime or by some future generations, because the statistics are what they are, the shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves in 3 generations. It's sometimes said that good advice comes from bad experience. And so you've taken all of this and what your family went through to help others as a family advisor. So maybe let's talk about that. And what are some of the more common situations that you're helping people grapple with?
Well, I'd love to talk about, without mentioning names, of course, of the situations I've helped clients with. One was a family where the husband had been one of the early executives at Amazon, and they had set up sizable trust funds for their daughters, and they didn't want to sort of ruin their daughters' lives by telling them they had all this money. But the daughters were in their early 20s, and they thought we should probably let them know that they have access to these funds. And so I advised them on how to approach it and how to get the conversation going and how to do it in a way that showed that they had trust in their daughter's wisdom about how to handle having this money, and that they expected them to do a great deal with their lives and follow their passions and to be successful in their own right, while also having access to this money. And that's a tricky balancing act for a parent.
It sure is. And it's something that just about everybody worries about, thinks about, doesn't know whether they've got the right approach. Are there certain principles that you follow?
Well, I have a program that I've developed that I've seen in action is incredibly helpful. And it's called a resilient family model. So usually I work with, in a situation like this, just with the parents usually, and then maybe with the kids later on, and we can have like a whole family-wide discussion, but everyone gets to express their point of view on a situation. And then we try to figure out among all the family members, like what the family call to action is. So clearly in this situation, the call to action was for the parents, we need to tell the kids about the money and do it in a loving way that shows how much we trust them. And I will say about with my own family, those kinds of conversations usually did not happen in a way where trust was expressed. And I saw the negative impact of that with my brothers, for example. And this is messaging that has to start in childhood with kids. It doesn't start when they're 21 and you're about to tell them they have a trust fund. So I think most parents especially parents who have recently come into money through a liquidity event, they're so savvy these days. People are really, they were the wealth creators. And so usually they're communicating with that next generation that saw them make the money. And so everything's going to be fine as that wealth gets transferred to the second generation. It's usually the third and fourth generation,
right,
that you have to worry about statistically.
It reminds me of something somebody said to me the other day about inheritors. So if it's this third or fourth generation, somebody made the observation that inheritors of large fortunes are typically one of two things: arrogant or frightened. What's your take on that?
Usually it's a combination of both. And often they have low self-esteem, which leads often to substance abuse and potentially addiction issues and sometimes mental illness. So there's often a whole constellation of issues going on. And it can also just be very paralyzing because your motivation might not be there. And wealth can be it's an incredible source of energy to create more wealth. And if you have been raised to think about it that way and to use it that way and to just, go out and like realize your dreams in a very positive way or help the world with this wealth, that's great. But if it's used in a self-destructive way, which too often it is, and I do attribute a lot of that to the wrong messages that were absorbed in childhood around wealth. Maybe your parent was self-destructive with it, and so you're also going to be self-destructive with it. So it's the role modeling is just so important, and the messaging. And you can't say, do as I say, but not as I do. The role modeling really has to be there from the parental side.
You mentioned keeping wealth, and it reminds me of something else. I think you listened to the episode I did with Derek Bullen last season on this podcast.
That's right. It was great.
He, very successful entrepreneur, self-made, lots of money. And he said in his experience, it's harder to keep money than to make money, which I find extraordinary.
Well, I totally agreed with him, because if you've got an operating business and you have a bad year, you've still got the business, and the next year can be better and you can make up for the bad year. Whereas if you think about some people who had a bad year in the stock market last year, and maybe they panicked and sold, and all of a sudden, in January, the market shoots up again, you can't recover that loss. So with investing, it's so much about luck and timing, whereas with an operating business, it's really up to you if it's going to succeed or not. Sure, there are market forces out there, but a lot of it is your own blood, sweat, and tears, whereas investing is very timing based, and that's absolutely down to luck in many cases.
In addition to the importance of positive role modeling, Frances is ardent in her warnings about the perils of too much wealth in the hands of young people who aren't prepared for it. And given the tremendous amount of wealth creation in recent years, I know there are a lot of people who suddenly come into money and worry about how it could impact their children. I asked Frances what one piece of advice she would have for them.
Well, if they have children, I would say because their estate planning advisors are, of course, telling them you have to put, in order to save the money from taxes, you've got to set up these generation skipping trusts. I would say put into the trust documents that your kids don't get to touch that money until maybe they're in their early to mid 40s.
And why that?
Well, because ultimately they get out of college in their early 20s, and they've got 20 years during which they have to figure out their own lives and go out and roll up their sleeves, carve out their own identities, pursue their passions, get jobs, hopefully on their own, not jobs their parents get for them, because that doesn't count, and build some grit. Because really, they won't be people who can manage that wealth appropriately and make good decisions with it in their early 20s. And they could use it in a very self-destructive way. And at the very least, it will rob their lives of the meaning that going out into the world and making your own life happen gives you.
So what do you say to parents who say, well, look, I want to help my kids now. They're struggling to buy a home. You're in San Francisco. I'm in Toronto, two very expensive cities. Or they've got young kids and, I could support them with private school education for my grandchildren.
Well, that's different. So that's a nuance I would add to what I was saying earlier. A down payment for a house and paying for private school education, which is obviously off the charts these days. And the private school education actually is moving money out of your estate in a tax-free way. So from an estate planning point of view, I agree with that. But in terms of a large income that will support them, whether they have a job or not, that's what I advise against.
It can be a slippery slope, though, too, can't it? So let's say they have the down payment to buy a house in a neighborhood that they couldn't otherwise have afforded on their own. Well, now that neighborhood comes with, I've got to drive a certain car, and I've got to belong to this club, and I've got a lifestyle that's commensurate with this neighborhood. Sometimes it's a slippery slope of creating dependence.
Right. It's true. It's a tough one. And each one of those milestones in your thinking needs to be considered with a lot of care. I would say every life situation is different. Every child has different needs, but really the prevailing theme should be, I want my kids to be happy. And to be happy, you need to have meaning in your life. And in order to have meaning in your life, you need to have something to strive for. And if I hand them everything, or even most of everything, they're not going to have anything to strive for. So I'm robbing my children of happiness. And I've seen this time and time again, especially in the later generations in wealthy families. So my advice always is be very careful with handing over trust funds too early or too much money too soon.
Great. Thank you. This has been so nice. Thank you so much for writing this book and sharing your story, and then sharing your story with me and this podcast. We've been talking a lot about money, and now I've got a few more money questions for you as part of the rapid fire segment that I do at the end of each podcast. And so I want to ask you just a few questions. Of these 4 activities, which is the most difficult for you? Saving, spending, investing, or giving money away?
I would say spending. I always think 3 times before I spend a large sum of money. And I think about it 3 times because I love the feeling of investing. I love the feeling of giving money away to a cause I believe in. And I'm not going to say I love saving, but for me, saving and investing are essentially the same thing.
Hand in hand, yeah.
So yeah, I would say even though I'm not necessarily a hugely frugal person, I do like to enjoy my life. When it comes to big expenses, I think 3 times for those reasons.
And so would the easiest be investing?
I would say investing and giving.
And I noticed that you gave a portion of the proceeds of this book to a charity in Detroit, which was really nice.
That's right. 826 Michigan, who they were building a new tutoring center at the time that the book was published. And the tutoring center was right in Detroit. They already had one in Ann Arbor, and it's an organization I've been involved with, started by day vagaries out here in San Francisco, the original tutoring center, 826 Valencia. So I've done some fun stuff with them, and it was great to get involved with the one in Michigan as well.
That's great. Do you have a favorite, speaking of spending though, do you have a favorite guilty pleasure financially?
Great restaurants. Just can't get enough of them. There's so many right here in San Francisco, and travel. And I don't feel guilty about either of those. So I don't know if I have any guilty pleasures, but actually I have a vintage Porsche. That's probably my one guilty pleasure from 1983. And I love it.
You have a college-age son. What do you most want him to know about money?
Well, he fortunately has attended many of my talks in front of different groups, many of them family business groups and high net worth audiences. And he's heard me talk to these audiences about the importance of their kids going out into the world and making their own way and not getting too much too soon. And so he knows for himself that was the messaging for him from the get-go. And so I just love the fact that that's been reiterated so many times. And now he's very much absorbed that. And when he's got a big expense, he'll call me up and say, oh, I should just go out and get a job so I can pay for this. And I'm like, no, don't worry. I can pay for it. I want you to just study and get your work done. You don't have time to go get a job. But the fact that that's his impulse is really lovely. So there's no sense of entitlement, which I'm very proud of him for that.
In your mind, what constitutes a truly wealthy life?
A truly wealthy life is a life full of love, human connection with the ones we love, and in my opinion, travel and experiences. So my son and I spent many, many summers and then a gap year traveling in Europe, starting when he was about 11 years old and going to all the museums and talking about the art and exposing him to all of that culture and doing that together. And just having and now my iPhone sends me all these videos of all those experiences we had together, and I'm always sending them to him. And it's just, there's no greater pleasure than creating a life of memories, and no material object could ever take the place of any of those. So I'm extremely grateful that I was able to do those things with him. That's the ultimate privilege.
Thanks for listening, everyone, and I hope you took as much from this conversation as I did. I want to thank my guest, Frances Stroh, for sharing her family story with such sensitivity and vulnerability. I think it's really rare to be able to talk so openly about a family's reversal of fortune, and especially in a way that can serve as a cautionary tale for others. If you'd like to reach out to Frances for a speaking engagement or to inquire about her advisory services, you can contact her at francesstroh.com. That's STROH.com. And if you're interested in reading her book, again, it's Beer Money, a Memoir of Privilege and Loss. I highly recommend it. If you enjoyed the content, please leave us a rating or review. We so appreciate it. And again, thanks for listening to Serious Coin. Serious Coin is provided for your general interest only, and nothing we discuss should be taken as investment, tax, legal, or other professional advice. Always talk to a licensed professional before you make any financial decisions.